Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We live in a world, we see it in the interpretation of our own founding documents, the Constitution of the United States. We live in a world where the traditions embodied in that document have to be respected. The text of it has to be respected, but yet we have to apply it in ways that are cognizant of the way the world is changing and issues and problems that were never contemplated, could never possibly have been contemplated by the drafters of that document.
Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be a part of the conversation today and be the foil and to sort of moderate and open the door to Jon Palmer of Microsoft to hear his views on this theme of AI, ethics, law, and faith. Jon, as you know, is the General Counsel of Microsoft. And so therefore he has at a summit and at a privileged position in shaping the direction of the technology so that it aligns with human values. It's fabulous to be here to unpack these deep issues. So to begin, let me, Jon, ask you a very basic question. We start at the foundation, which is when we say tech policy, what do we mean by that?
Well, thank you, Ken. And I will certainly get to that question, but let me also just add my thanks for the invitation and my thanks to you, Ken, for agreeing to have this conversation. It is an honor as well for me to participate. I also just will say, as you have no doubt heard in other circumstances, that the views that I'm expressing are my own views. They're not the views of Microsoft or in my capacity as General Counsel, although obviously I do have a perspective there. Let me now turn to your question. I guess the way I think about what we mean when we say tech policy really is just the bundle of principles and norms that govern how technology is developed, deployed, managed, and then ultimately used. We're all familiar with some of the common subjects of technology policy that have been prominent in recent years, including privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property policy, consumer public safety, accessibility, even labor economics. All of those issues are, of course, relevant to any technological advance and certainly relevant to generative AI as we're seeing that unfold, that technology unfold.
Okay, so when you think about it, who should do what? And what I mean by that is if we can see what the range of issues are, what needs to happen and who should be the agents of, or the actors, the agents of change to do that thing?
It's a great question. I think of policy just generally, and certainly this is true with technology policy, is a team sport. Sometimes there's a misperception that sort of policy is sort of handed down from on high in the form of laws and regulations from governments, and that certainly happens at times. But really, there are multiple sources of policy that may eventually mature into law and regulation, and the three in particular that I think of, one is obviously the state, the government. Governments around the world are creating policy, no question about that. But you also have civil society and you have the technology companies or private sector itself. So civil society, including, religious organizations, labor organizations, academia, et cetera. And in the case of AI, it's really interesting. In many respects, the original source of policy came from the tech sector itself. Microsoft founded an Office of Responsible AI years ago and began thinking about the implications, including the ethical implications of what it means to roll out a technology responsibly. And civil society was definitely part of that dialogue all along the way. And many of the voluntary norms that the tech sector itself came together and agreed to adhere to, eventually matured into law. You can think of the AI risk management framework in the United States itself, which was a voluntary framework built on industry standards that the tech sector came together to agree to, and then around certain pillars of fairness, transparency, accountability, et cetera. And then that eventually evolved into lawmaking. So that's just one example. There are many examples. Civil society, for instance, has been very important as an independent source of policy around deepfakes in generative AI and in working with the tech sector to develop tools, content credentials, and so forth to combat the problems surrounding deepfakes. So I really think of it as a team sport, as I said. There's one other way, just as I think about it, that policy develops, and that's through disputes, through actual litigation. Courts make decisions which become the law of the land. You think about right now the copyright cases where artists and creators and journalists have filed lawsuits against the foundation, AI frontier model builders. The question really is, can those generative AI models be trained on copyrighted material? Well, that's an issue of policy that's ultimately will be decided by the courts.
If we have these values and we have policy, how do we make sure these values that we have that are definitely not going to be shared, because what is acceptable in one community, we'll call one nation, versus another nation will be different. How does it get accepted? How does it get put into and expressed into policy? Is there always going to be an inherent tension between, obviously in America, we have this idea of the standards of local norms. Is there any common ground that we can have in tech policy that would be global, or are we going to be living in a world of tech policies, this sort of fragmentary environment in which there'll be the rules that govern, say, content in Saudi Arabia and the rules that govern content in New York City?
Well, I mean, you've hit on one of the issues that occupies a lot of my time, frankly, which is the balkanization of policy globally. Microsoft is a global company, and I think about that a lot. And certainly you put your finger on it. What may be accepted policy as an expression of values in one country may be quite different, or one region may be different from another. You even see that among the states in the United States right now. The 50 states are all engaged in policymaking on issues like privacy and AI and numerous other issues, and they don't all agree. There is this issue of fragmentation. With that said, there are emerging global norms. I mean, the Hiroshima process, where nations came together and really made an effort to agree on foundational principles. Nations and tech companies came together to agree on foundational principles to apply in the development of and the deployment of artificial intelligence, including an agreement that humans should be at the center of that development and control. So there are emerging global norms, but like any policy or any set of laws, it takes a while. It takes a while to develop something that is truly a global norm, because it's a messy process. There's a lot of sausage making, policy being formed in the European Union, for instance. They're probably out in front of other regions. They've got the EU AI Act, which is a sweeping bit of legislation that may have influence in other parts of the world. And, eventually, like I think we're seeing with privacy, you will get to a set of common denominators that help companies sort of organize themselves and govern themselves. So it's a messy process.
I want to put a pin on something that you said so we can come back to it, but I want to signal to you right now what it is so that you can sort of have it in the back of your mind. And it's this idea that humans should be at the center of AI. And a very ungracious and challenging question to that would be, and it's not against you, it's against the issue, is that sounds really good in theory, and it sounds ridiculous in practice. And what I'm going to mean by that is that just not words and verbiage. What would that actually mean concretely in practice? And does it actually really make sense in terms of what we know about the technology and all of the value that it can bring? Maybe that shouldn't be the principle. But let's not answer that now, because I want to take things further on, a little bit deeper into the direction that we're going in, because I think that would be a distraction. But that'll be a little kind of off-ramp as we get towards the end of our conversation. I want to widen the aperture a bit. We've talked about tech policy. Now let's take a look at the U.S. legal system. What is the influence of religion on U.S. law and ethics?
Well, I think in a very broad sense, it's hard to separate the Anglo-American legal system or Anglo-American law from its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So in sort of the deepest sense of that question, the two are intertwined. I'll break it down into sort of one really major substantive area maybe that I think of, and then also in a way we even approach the law, the interpretive tools that we use to approach the law and the impact of the tradition on that. I mean, substantively, I think, the whole concept of the rule of law and its roots in the concept of human dignity, I think, come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm not suggesting it's the only religious tradition or cultural tradition that places a great value on human dignity. But that certainly is a very fundamental thread that has been hugely influential. Some go back to the Magna Carta in the 13th century as sort of the watershed moment when you think of the rule of law, the foundations of legal system, this king being under the law, the state being under the law, concepts of due process, rights to a fair trial, et cetera. But really, as I think about it, it traces back even to the creation narrative that humans were created in God's image. They're equal before God. It goes through the book of Job, the right to be heard, the 10 Commandments and the moral code, to even to Nathan the prophet and his challenge to King David, David being under the law. That is really the foundation of the rule of law that I think has set the framework for the Anglo-American concept of law that we inherited from England and that we continue to build on. And that really does go back to this value placed on human dignity, due process, et cetera. The rights come out of that. The second point I mentioned is this sort of interpretive framework, which is, generally in law, we ask ourselves, what does the text say? That's the first question. What does the text of the law say? And you think about the biblical narrative, there's a lot written about what the text of the law says and what does it mean. But we also ask ourselves, what does the text mean in a broader context? What's the purpose? What's the animating principle of the law? And lawyers and judges use both of those interpretive models. Some are more wedded to the text, textualists. Some are more wedded to the animating principle or the purpose of this. But the frameworks themselves really come right out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right out of the Bible, right out of the New Testament even. If you think of the battles between Jesus Christ and the Pharisees, it's really a battle between some technical narrow interpretations of the law and the Pharisee movement and fidelity to the text. And it's set against Jesus's interpretations based on this broader purpose of the law. So we're the inheritor of both of those traditions, and they're both important. The text is obviously important, but it's also important to look at what the overarching principle is, and we inherited that. So, even going back to is it legal to heal on the Sabbath? The question put to Jesus Christ. Well, he goes to the higher purpose. Is it good to do good and save life or to kill? What's the ultimate purpose of the law? It's that sort of interpretive framework that really guides us. And that even is in the copyright case that I just mentioned. It's what's the animating principle of copyright? We have to look to that to solve the problem.
It's so interesting because the reframing, the shift is from principle to practice. And there's a pragmatic element where it's results driven rather than and output driven rather than input driven. That's a quite interesting dimension. I mean, one of the classic reframings of the Christian world from the Jewish one is that shift to the practical, to the pragmatic, where you're looking at the outcome rather than the input that goes into it. Is there any other example where you'd look at a contemporary debate in tech policy where you actually see, other than copyright, where you actually see this issue animated?
You mean the tension between sort of the text and the higher purpose or the broader purpose?
It could be the text and the higher purpose, or this idea where where if you scratch the surface underneath it of the current debate in tech policy, that you see a level of, I don't want to say religiosity, but that understanding something about human dignity that comes to us through the law, through the Judeo-Christian tradition, is animate. That if you put a microscope to it, you say, hey, who knew? It's there in front of us.
I think you can find it in almost any legal debate, honestly. If you looked at the debate over privacy and what does privacy mean, that's probably the quintessential, most recent example. What does it really mean? And what is the output? What is the result we're really seeking? How do you balance, in essence, the higher purpose of why we want to preserve the dignity of human beings, which means not intruding into their private lives in ways that really undermine that dignity, versus, hey, we've got to live in a world where we need to know some things about people in order to conduct ourselves as a society for the common good. You see that it play out, and you can probably point to almost any true legal debate, and you see these forces at play.
Do you think, is the law able to take on the modern state is a secular institution? And in fact, we have built it on the foundation of separating church and state. Do you feel that the law, as it's evolved, has been leaving behind that foundation of spirituality and is going into a different direction? Or do you think that as it evolves, that it's carrying spirituality with it. Or when I say spirituality, I mean that foundation of the dignity of the individual. Sort of asking you to grade the law on a scale, maybe A to F. How's it doing in terms of adhering to its own values and its traditions?
That's a fascinating question to put to a lawyer, or probably anyone. How do I grade the law? And to go back to where you started, does it carry with it the traditions? Of course it does. And that's important. We live in a world, we see it in the interpretation of our own founding documents, the Constitution of the United States. We live in a world where the traditions embodied in that document have to be respected. The text of it has to be respected, but yet we have to apply it in ways that are cognizant of the way the world is changing and issues and problems that were never contemplated, could never possibly have been contemplated by the drafters of that document. So when I look at the law and your question about, the religious influence on the law, yes, there are really two foundational points that one can make. One is, as I said, the law came to us from England, at least in the American tradition, the law came to us from England. It was deeply influenced at that time and had been throughout history by the Judeo-Christian religions, traditions, and other influences as well. But few things about law and policy are immutable. Almost nothing is immutable. And law always emerges and develops in its own cultural and historical context. And as new cultural norms are developed, the law has to adapt to that. In my view, the law remains very heavily influenced by religion, both if you think of it at the inception, but it continues to be influenced by religion because religion is a big part of the cultural stew we live in today. And the law has to obviously adapt to that. And we can all think of perfect examples right now that we're dealing with in our own country of how religion and our cultural norms are influencing the development of policy.
Now, I realize that when we're talking about religion, we're not talking about one thing, we're talking about so much. And in fact, often in our speech just now, we're actually speaking with hyphens or slashes, and we're accepting that. So Judeo-Christian is one thing, but it could also be two. There's Christianity, there's also Catholicism. So I would pose the question whether when you think about how spirituality, religion, faith gets transmuted from the spiritual, in the pew into the law, into the legislature, whether there's actually a clash of interests, values, perspectives, theological reasonings, that which people hold dear versus they're willing to find mutable in terms of the practical, as you brought up. If religion's not one thing, how does, say, in this case, American law, adjudicate the interests of different spiritual groups who want to have different values put into how society should be governed?
Well, again, I think you put your finger on a really important point, which is, let me reframe maybe your question. I mean, as I'm hearing it is, how do these disputes, whether they're between religions or denominations or even debates within a single church itself, how does that dialogue or those disputes ultimately influence the law? And I think you see exactly that happening. Almost every issue in the current American culture war, almost every issue, I would say, originated as a religious question or matter of dispute, created schisms within denominations or disagreements in doctrine between different religious traditions, or even schisms within a single church congregation. And those disputes then bleed into the public dialogue and they bleed into the culture at large. And then they ultimately become the subject of political debate, and they ultimately become the subject of policy. And we see that happening every day in this country and in around the world as well. But in this country, I think the religious debate has always been very close to the surface of the public debate and the political debate and ultimately the policy debate.
So if the foundation of the law is religious, if the foundation of the state is secular, as culture has become more atheist over the last few years, has that changed law?
I think without question, yes. Whatever the religious beliefs are represented in a culture, this is my foundational point, that it will be reflected in the law. It will be reflected in policy. Without question, you have in this religious debate, atheists are certainly a part of that debate, a very important part of the debate, some might say. When I think of the state as a secular state, though, I don't think the position of the state under our Constitution. It just simply put the state itself is not going to take a position on religion, right? That's the meaning of a secular state. That's absolutely clear in the First Amendment. The state cannot participate in the establishment of a religion, particular sect or creed. It can't prohibit the freedom of exercise. That doesn't mean that debate, the religious debate, and this is, I think, the point we're talking about, it doesn't mean that religious debate doesn't then bubble up to the surface and become essentially part of the secular policy debate. And atheists have a seat at the table without question.
So we've spoken about tech policy. We've spoken about US law. Let me now shift into one maybe final dimension, which is you and your relationship to both and to religion. The basic question there would be, how has religion influenced your own professional life? For one thing, you chose not to follow your father's footstep and become a minister, but you became a lawyer to uphold justice. But beyond that.
Well, I never even contemplated becoming a minister, but my father would have been a great lawyer because he was a great interpreter of text and a very persuasive man. So I think he would have been a great lawyer. I would not have made a very good minister. But the law really, I think, drew me in, I think in part because of some of the things we've been talking about today. The rule of law itself means a great deal to me. I view it as one of the most stabilizing and enabling institutions in human history. This concept of the rule of law, the state being under the law, there being rules to live by. And I've lived in countries under authoritarian regimes where you do not have the rule of law. They're not governed by the rule of law, that governments rather use the law to rule others, in essence. And that's rule by law, very different concept from the rule of law. It is rooted in these concepts of rule under the law, due process, the rights of the individual. So that is very important to me and has always been something that has drawn me to the law. The second, as I mentioned, this interpretive framework, this legal frame that you put on things. Let's look at the text. Let's look at what is right in front of us and what it says and ask ourselves, but let's look at the higher purpose. Let's look at the animating principle, the distillation. That's always been an interesting way for me to analyze the world around me. I mean, my dad used to say in his own interpretive exercises, major in the majors, right? Don't get lost in the details or the weeds. Look at the heart of the matter. You know, that's what Matthew 22 says. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. It's a distillation. And I think that's a tradition we need. Sometimes we hang our policy and arguments and legal arguments on very technical details or smaller ideas. But to me, one of the things that drew me to the law is not that technical analysis, but really the ability to look at the bigger picture. And then I guess the third point I would say, I was a litigator for 30 years, and some might think that that's a nasty business. Litigation can be, hard fought and so forth. But I've always thought of it also as an instrument of peace. It's a set of tools that help people work through and resolve conflicts in an ethical way under a set of rules and procedures. And ironically, I think that adversarial process of litigating conflict in this country and in other countries that have this concept of a judiciary, trials, litigation, it really is a means of peacemaking. It's a means of conflict resolution without bloodshed. And it's amazing how that process has resolved so many very, very consequential conflicts in this country over its history. Interpersonal conflicts over the division of economic spoils, you name it. Every facet of our society, every part of our culture in some sense has been litigated throughout our history. And usually we get to a solution without breaking it out into violence. And that's something to be proud of. And that's something that I am proud of in our legal tradition.
Very interesting. And it seems as if, in a sense, you view your role as a lawyer, the way you practice law, the ethics as you see the law embodying, as having sort of being as the foundation of a Christian doctrine.
That's the way I settled on it in my own mind. I view myself as really just a practitioner, a user of this toolkit, but the toolkit itself carries with it this incredible history and tradition and moral code and system of ethics.
Fantastic. I can't but ask a question about the future, which is how you see the future of technology policy and as it dovetails with religion.
I'll start by saying we all have to be pretty humble here. because I feel like we're at the beginning of a new industrial revolution. Generative AI as a general purpose technology, I think is going to it's going to sweep across every economy. It's going to touch all sorts. It's going to touch almost everything that we engage in culturally. And so I think we have to, in essence, be somewhat humble and not trying to predict too much about what's going to happen in the future. I mean, who would have known when the printing press was developed what that would mean, what that would unleash on the world? Who would have known when the steam engine was developed what changes that would bring, or when electricity, alternating current, was developed? And I think really we're at a point in history where we're going to see something of that consequence. And so part of it is, I think, humility. And, part of it is we need to keep our heads on. We need to really keep this concept of human dignity front and center. This technology has a capacity to dehumanize. It also has a capacity to help humanity in ways that we can't even contemplate, to cure diseases, to assist those who have disabilities, to empower humans, no matter what their capabilities, to achieve more, to create more. So I think we need to somehow keep our heads about us and focus on the good and worry about the weaponization at the same time. And that can be a hard thing to do. But that's why we need principles. That's why we need governance. That's why we need laws. That's why we need regulations and policies. And we can't just leave it up to technology companies to do all that. We need to engage in that as a society.
May I ask a ridiculous question? One that you don't want to answer? Of course. I've realized that it's ridiculous that I haven't even asked it yet, because it's obvious that this is where it goes. The puck travels. As AI becomes so much more performant, there's been so many scholars around the world talking about robot rights. Yes, AI consciousness and artificial consciousness, leave that aside. The idea that we should somehow give rights to robots. What is your view?
Yeah, I don't think so. That really takes what I think is fundamentally a fundamental part of being human, which is humans have rights, fundamental human rights, and applying it to machines. No, I think fundamental human rights are human rights, legal rights, full stop. So it's hard for me to see a world in which we would go that far. But again, as I said, we all have to, and I certainly have to be humble. I do think it's important for technology companies to listen to all of these viewpoints, but should robots be entitled to privacy protections or copyright protections or First Amendment protections or any of the things we've been talking about today? No, I don't see that.
They've got to take themselves to Switzerland or at a clinic if they want to deactivate themselves. Exactly. Well, you would be accused of being a speciesist, but I will tell you that I too would be accused by others of being a speciesist. With this, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenn. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.